Maybe just to move before we, obviously this is pertinent 2 or 3 images shot by a very brave photographer in Bury at the time of the Sharpeville massacre, which I think is the 21st of March 1960. But one mustn't forget that we've had our own Sharpeville almost 10 years ago. It'll be Tuesday, will be the 10-year anniversary of the Marikana massacre and shootings. But I think there's something very pertinent which we'll talk about for William, particularly something that happened around the inquest that took place where his father was very central in the legal proceedings. But I just wanted you to speak maybe a little bit about how you remember Sharpeville.
Okay, so the Sharpeville, there was a certain point, the treason trial was continuing in Pretoria. And then there was this protest organized, I think, by the Pan-Africanist Congress, not by the ANC, of defiance all around. And the Sharpeville crowd gathered around the police station, and police opened fire and killed 69 people and injured many, many others. And immediately there was a state of emergency declared, at which point the clients in the treason trial said then that the trial couldn't proceed, and they dismissed their lawyers. They said, not a way in which a trial can proceed. And in that gap, my father appeared for in fact, I think he appeared for Ambrose Reeves, the Bishop of Johannesburg, to lead evidence and to find out what happened at the Sharpeville massacre. So it was in the middle of the treason trial, there was the inquest into, or the inquiry, it wasn't an inquest, an inquiry into the events at Sharpeville. In the treason trial, he'd been one of the more junior advocates. Here he was one of the more senior advocates. So he'd be working every night in his office. And I once went in, I was 6 then, I guess, 5 or 6, went into his study in the house. And there was this yellow box, which looked to me like a box of dairy-made chocolates. It's about that high, this size. It could have held a beautiful layer of chocolate. So knowing I was doing what I shouldn't do, which was to go and steal a chocolate from the chocolate box. I opened it, but instead of the chocolates in the box, there was this pile of 8x10 glossy black and white photographs, like the ones here. And not just these, but close-ups of people who'd been shot. A small entry wound at the front, a huge exit wound at the back, which was fundamentally shocking. It was shocking that this could exist in the world. This sort of violence, hadn't known about it. It was different from pointing a finger at another child and playing soldiers. So I immediately closed the box and didn't ever mention it, I suppose. I felt the guilty one, having opened the box when I knew I shouldn't have opened this Pandora's box. And I told years later, I'd written about it and I told the story several times. And I had one public conversation with my father in Frankfurt where we spoke about our different memories, my memory of the treason trial, his memory of the treason trial, my memory of all the different events, the chronology. And at that event, he said, yes, I'd known that, he said he'd heard that story, but what he'd never done before was, as he put it, to apologize to me. I thought, what for? He said, for having left these photographs where a 5-year-old could find them. But anyway, it was. And many years later, when I made the film Felix in Exile, which was a lot of drawings of bodies in the veldt, of bodies being absorbed by the landscape, even though I hadn't thought of these photographs at the time, I'm sure there was an echo back into them.
I mean, this is an incredible, I know that from that same interview. It was actually, unfortunately, he's passed away, Akwen Wizo, very young, he was 55, a genius curator as far as I'm concerned. He was head of a place called Huis de Kunst, where they had a very important show that he curated along with Roy Bester from South Africa, called The Rise and Fall of Apartheid. It was in, I'm getting it wrong now, I think it was in, I thought it was Munich, but I could be wrong, but 2012.
Okay, 12 or 15, something.
Yeah, right. But this also came up in this interview. It's an incredible interview, and you can access it easily on YouTube. Chief Albert Lutuli, if you can just talk through that, visited, when you also 5 or 6 or 7, visited the house, obviously, I think, to consult your father.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of, during the time of that, there were a lot of clients of African clients that came to consult or see my dad. But by and large, it was, as would be familiar, a typical Johannesburg childhood of the family house, and then in the backyard, some rooms at which a manservant and a woman servant lived and came in. And essentially, that was the primary way in which a white child in the suburbs met black people, through the nanny who was very close to the children, to other people who worked in the garden and things like that. And I only kind of understood this shift when Luthuli came for supper one night, and after supper he went into the kitchen to greet the cook and the cleaner, and their kind of astonishment at him coming in and their respect and wonder at him being there made me think, oh, okay, this is a different, have to start calibrating who are, that what are the different kinds of people that there are, that not everyone is a cook and a gardener. To denaturalize the condition of suburban South Africa. So that was my memory of Luthuli in the house. My memory of Desmond Tutu in the house was when I was an adolescent. I remember came back one evening and was having drinks with my parents together with his wife Leah. And I remember him saying to his wife, Leah, remind me, dear, is it whiskey I like or brandy? I thought, okay, that's also. And with Mandela, it was later on after he'd been released, and my father reporting of meeting him at some event where he said to him, Sydney, I'm not sure if you remember me.
And then this one pertinently, the next question, so this is now, as you can see from the portraits, portrait on the left is taken at Steve Biko's funeral in September 1977 in Queenstown. And then I was surprised with the government. I was a little kid. I mean, I was born in 1968, so I was like 8 years old, but I did remember it happening, seeing it in the newspaper more than on television. And I think this is where your father really, came to world and international prominence through his brilliant and incisive, brutal cross-examination of the state, and particularly the security police. And I just want to say now that I think the important thing here, William being 1977, you've been born in 1955, now it's a different context, because now politically and consciously, now you're 22 years old, number one. But so if I could ask, like, how did your father, when you would come back every day, or maybe where was the inquest?
It was in Pretoria.
When you come back every day, was there a sort of rule that he wouldn't talk about all these awful, disgusting facts like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or was there sort of discussion at the dining room table in the house about what was going on, or was he sort of very professional and kept it?
No, I mean, there'd be a lot of talk about it. I remember, you'd always know my father was enraged if he either rubbed his nose, or rubbed his knee, or jiggled the coins in his pocket, which were kind of two things. And he was in a rage about what was happening, but the person who really expressed the rage was my mother. She would be boiling at the dinner table. So it was discussed. It was also, one of the real regrets I have is that I only went, I think, twice to the inquest to see my dad in action, which was really him at his prime, at his peak, I think. But there was a lot of international press coverage. There were huge numbers of journalists that came to follow the event.
I mean, this is so incredible. I mean, I've always loved William's printmaking. So right from the time I started I worked in a junior capacity after I finished the army at Stephen Velson Company. As much as you look at big paintings and PNFs and Stearns and things like that, I was always very more interested in modest prints, whether they're Scottness and certainly William's work. I mean, I saw an impression of Casper's Full of Love in my second year. In fact, you donated as a benefit because Bill Ainsley had died. It was a benefit for the Art Foundation, but also for his widow, Fika Ainsley. And that completely just got me because most of the things were quite pedestrian that were being made that I was at least seeing coming up for auction, quite pretty and sedate and sedential and so on. And then suddenly here was an artist actually, I'd just come out of the army, actually committed to actually challenging this weird paradox of, the idea of a Casper, but then this term, Casper's Full of Love, everything that they weren't about. So I'm just sort of mentioning that, etching particularly is what I'm most interested in. Then going into obviously having the privilege to look at William's personal archive, which is extensive and very good, and also of the original works. I mean, one of my favorites, I've never seen it before, I've known about it, is this magnificent, it's actually a pure aquatinta. There might be a bit of dry point of your father. Again, when the catalogue raisonné comes out, the first volume, you actually realize as well that I think in this case, this is in 4 plate progressions. But maybe if you could just talk a little bit about, because it was made at the Ainsley Studios or the Art Foundation, and just a little bit about, because it's done in 1979, so it's 2 years after the case, but you get the idea it's based on those kinds of images that we've just looked at from the newspaper. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about your etching at Ainsley?
At the foundation.
Foundation.
So the Art Foundation started off as a private school. Bill Ainsley, the artist, had a few students who would come once a week or twice a week, and gradually it expanded, and there were some full-time students and full-time teachers, and then it became a fully fledged art school. And while I was at Wits, in the first year I did fine arts as one of the subjects you could do, but dropped out after 6 months. It was in a terrible state, that department then, and the teaching was terrible. And then I had a couple of years full-time or part-time I guess, at the Art Foundation while I was still at Wits doing my undergraduate degree. It was a school that offered no certification, no degree. It was a mixture of people who really were very passionate about their art, about what they were making, and also problem children that their parents sent there to keep them out the way and keep them out of trouble. So it was a mixture of, and in some ways it was a terrible art school in terms of teaching technique, teaching how to do things. It was all the things which one wished one was taught and saw years later, but didn't. But what it did do, what it had, which was unique and which was remarkable, for which I'm forever grateful, was firstly, it was a mixture of not only, Wits was a white university, remember, in that era, all the students were white. There were 1 or 2 exceptions which were granted by the minister. But it was an art school that was, and a centre which was very mixed. I mean, there was both Simon Twangetwa, Pat Mutlau, Bongi Dlomo, David Korwani. The artists one knows from that era were either students or associates working at the foundation. So that was a kind of, against that, the lack of technique of how to make a proper glaze with rose madder and turpentine is very. It also was a place in which there were many sideways people. There was Robert Beryl teaching poetry. There was Lionel Abrams, the editor and writer, doing writing classes. So it suddenly expanded what it was that one could do as a visual artist. What were the other fields? Language, text, all of those came into it. I was very interested in etching because I needed to find forms in which I could work which were not oil painting. I kind of came up against the wall, couldn't manage the material with oil paint. And so drawing was one, but printmaking became another. So I did a week's course with Catania, the printmaking teacher at Wits University, Giuseppe Catania, and on the strength of that became the teacher of etching at the Art Foundation. Yeah, that's the right kind of response to how much I knew and what I could do. And so even now, when I go to various print studios, I'm really interested to learn how it's meant to be done. And I see printmakers. It's the same when I go to an animation school, and I think, oh, that's how you're actually meant to get someone to look like they're walking when you're doing animation. So it was both pedagogically not a great school, but fundamentally a wonderful place, and I learned an enormous amount. Found myself in it.